Hello and welcome to this webinar on individual techniques and tactics out of possession in futsal and football. My name's Ian Parks. I'm an FA youth coach developer with the responsibility of supporting coaches and academies with futsal. And I'm pleased to be joined again by Mike Skubala, England Futsal Head Coach, and Graeme Carrick, another YCD with some great experience and insight. Hi chaps, how are you?
Hello, how you doing?
Nice to see you again. So this is the first in a short series on out of possession webinars. We've done a similar series on in possession, so do look out for these if you haven't already seen them. But today, the plan is to follow a similar pattern to the in possession webinars we've done. So in this one, we're going to look at 3 important individual techniques and tactics from a futsal perspective. And then following this, a couple of football clips to see what the detail looks like in that context. So let's get started. This is a pyramid we've been showing in all the webinars. The idea being that we're going to look at the individual stuff at the bottom layer of that left pyramid. The fact being it's the fundamentals, if you like, of the game. And if players can't do that right, then they're going to struggle to do what's further up the pyramid. Just in terms of the international stuff, the work Scoobs does, individual still really, really important. It doesn't disappear from the pyramid. But the likelihood is the time he's got with the players, he'll spend more time on strategy than the individual stuff. But a lot of people watching this, working with players on a regular basis, looking at the bottom part of that pyramid. So the 3 areas we're going to look at: pressing, marking, and intercepting, all of which are listed in like football documentation, if you like. So there's no difference there. I think they're actually quite closely linked. We're probably going to talk about the before, the during, and the after of these actions. And it can probably be argued that the before of pressing is almost like the during of marking, if you like. So if I'm waiting to go and get pressure on the ball, I'm actually marking someone already. So I think they're closely linked. But let's start with pressing. For those that haven't seen the other webinar series, we've always got this perception and decision as a key part of the slide. Just recognizing that what players see and feel is really important to the decisions they're going to make. So, whether there's pressure on the ball, what's around them, what players are around, that's all going to make have an influence on how they choose to press. What footed the opponent is, what strengths they've got. That's all stuff we need to consider within the technique of pressing. So that's probably enough talking from me. Let's get started and watch some footage. So just looking at pressing, and what we mean by pressing is not necessarily high pressing as a team, but it's that individual action. It's almost that idea of getting pressure on the ball. So what the key things are that we're looking at are getting pressure on the ball. So Scoobs, from your perspective, when your player's playing, what is it you're looking for when you're asking them to press or get pressure on the ball as an individual?
Yeah, I think for me, when you were talking about, I was thinking most people, when we look at our individual techniques and tactics, I think most people always naturally drop on the in possession thing with futsal. And I actually think that the first thing that futsal gives players for out of possession individual actions is the accountability of getting it right. So, if you don't get your pressing right, you don't get your marking right, you don't get your, defensive actions right individually, effectively you're going to be caught out in futsal. So I think it gives you really good feedback of what you're doing with your pressing actions. But I think the technique stuff's really important. So if you think about, I call it bilateral ability. So the ability to defend off both foot. So if we look here, that player there, closing the middle, showing it one way, but you need to do that off both sides of the body. Talk about defensive control. So we're talking about pressing quickly, pressing slowly sometimes, how you control as an individual, because that also is triggers for your opposition. So I think there's loads going on, but ultimately for me, the frame of reference for pressing is always the pressure on the ball. So if I want to be a good presser, I actually have to read the before action of what pressure is already on the ball. So you're right, it's secular in terms of what you spoke about before. It's actually a decision and then the technical action of it. I think this is a great clip of this. So if we used to slow some of these clips down, I was to pause some of it here. So the pressure on the ball here is okay. I wouldn't say it's great because the player can play forward. His hips are forward. He can play forward. He's got a pass. So closing, Raoni here is closing the middle. At the minute, there's this thing around, do you look in the eyes? You look at the hips? I like to think that you can, if you have to, you can look in the eyes to give you that sort of trigger, but it's ultimately down to the player as well. But there's different techniques that you can teach players in the indoor game, if you like, to do things. But the key thing here for me is the second player. Wallace here is looking at the pressure on the ball and looking at the body orientation of the ball player so that he could get more pressure on that side. So to be a good presser actually starts before the technical action of pressing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Cara?
Yeah, just going to come in on that around the before bit is vital. And we often talk about before, during, after around in possession, receiving skills and scanning. Yeah. But they're vital in all aspects of defending and certainly in pressing as an individual. So even from things like the position that you're in, that you take up, it'll then have impact on the distance. So like time and distance that you've got to cover to get active pressure on the ball. So all that comes into the decision making. So before plays a huge part on what you're actually going to be able to do. Now the during bit, one of the key bits I think which often gets overlooked is the individual balance, the actual physical ability to be in balance, especially as you arrive, to maintain balance. And in some ways it can be like almost like if when you think of fencing in the Olympics or whatever, where that type of thing where you want to get close to your opponent but be able to transition out at any moment. So if you overcommit physically and you're off balance, you can be beaten individually or you lose control of that moment. So being in balance in the during bit is vital, so you can adapt as the play moves, and it gives you the chance to transition out of that moment into the after. And a part of that comes whether you get body contact, how close you can get. All these things come into it as an individual when you are the person that is trying to actively get pressure on the ball.
Yeah, I agree with that. You can see this in this clip here. So Liam coming out has got great balance, and he's coming into quite fast because he knows he's got good pressure on. But then as he changed direction, the body orientation. So Liam here is cleverly putting some pressure on the strong foot of the Germany player to stop the diagonal pass through. And as he opens up, he's got great balance to check and change. But interestingly here, as you see, he's checking the pressure on the ball still that we spoke about. And then he's having a look, and now he decides to go and get fast pressure on as the ball travels. So again, the before phase here, and negative touch, weak pass, slow pass, backwards pass, great triggers that you teach the players in order to go and really go after the ball. So we call it defensive control, to then turning it into winning the ball back. And we have terms as a group, don't steal the ball, which means don't get sold. But actually there'll be times when you're pressing well, when you'll have the opportunity to go and steal, if you like, to go and nick it, which is what they've worked there as a group, really.
And I think the after bit is vital. So as you say, the balance it's not just about what you do at the ball, it's what you can do as the ball's gone or as your opponent gone. It's such a vital
the body contact coming in there, number 8, Liam, as the player passes it, he gets his arms up to block him making a forward run, doesn't he?
Yeah.
That's going to be the after of pressing. So some really good stuff there, guys. Thanks for that. And we've just got a notes page here for those that are watching. Some of this stuff will have come up, some wouldn't have. And I guess we didn't talk too much around the context either. Sometimes you might be you might press from when you're facing them. Sometimes you'd be pressing from behind or the side. So there's that to consider. There's actually the tackling element. I know, Scoobs, you mentioned there about actually not stealing the ball, but just getting pressure. But in different areas of the court, it might be that you get pressure on, you do actually get a block in or get a stab. So all sorts of things to think about. Also this anticipation. So we talked a lot about the perception, the before bit. What might those things be? So we saw there how England forced play back, maybe because they were going backwards. So then the next person can get closer, which means the pressure can be better. So there's just a few things to think about that maybe we did or didn't cover in that little section.
One important thing for Parksy, just as a deal, just to consider, is around the size of steps. the size of your strides.
Yeah. Go on.
Comes
so we've got footwork here, so that's something for people to think about. Or what do you mean by footwork? What do you mean by? Do you want small steps or do you want big steps? What do you want?
I think it's just around covering the distance. It depends on the distance, and it depends on your physiology. And there'll be when you talk about context linked with footwork, different players will have different tendencies and preferences as well. So some will. There's often real generalization. I can say this because I'm really big myself. That's why I understand it. I think is sometimes harder for bigger players to shift the balance quickly or to change direction quickly. That's not always, but you need to pay attention to it. So if you're caught with your legs too far apart and someone changes direction against you, it can be really hard once you've overcommitted to then readjust and get out of that moment.
Yeah.
So those things where your footwork, if you're too far apart as you arrive at the ball, that might be an issue.
Or too flat, too square.
So I was going to say, you naturally see, like, sometimes some of the better players will put the brakes on with 2 feet, and that's to do with the physical thing about being able to change direction. Not all. So what you'll find is, and some players try and turn with 1 foot, but gives them less power when they're recovering. So there's different actions. That's why we say playing bilaterally defensively off both sides, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can only defend left side or right side. But it's really important. I think that's really key, and that's the technical bit that needs to be aligned with the tactical bit as an individual. And at the higher level, how we talk about defensive feints, which basically means pretending to stab tackle, but actually not doing it. So how can you get a bit of an upper hand? Really key, that is.
And that cat and mouse always comes through, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, really key.
And that's why, again, we've got this off both sides at the top of every slide, because I think it's important that, in this context, marking, you can mark someone with that side of you, whether they're that side of you, you can get your feet right. So that's why that's there. Looking at marking in these next clips, particularly the positioning, context, and also tracking, I think, for me, is quite a big thing. I think it's something that in futsal, it happens all the time. A bit of the after action, if you like. If a player's played, you're still marking them. We just said with Liam, but you start to then track them. I think it's really important we look at that. So let's have a look at these marking. So it's almost the bit before they go and press the ball, isn't it, that we're looking at?
I think it's important not to forget some of the simple things around marking, around being able to see the ball and see your opponent.
Yeah, definitely. We talk about the defensive triangle when you're marking. So you've got to do like a job and a half. So you need to know what pressure's on the ball. You need to know what you can see your player. And in reference to that, you need to be in a good position in between you and the goal. So, we're talking about strong side. So if you were to look at the guy with the yellow boots here, Richard Wars, this movement here, look what he does really slightly. Just tweaks inside a bit. He's got a defensive triangle in between the goal, relation to his player 13 and the pressure on the ball. If there was more pressure on the ball here, he probably wouldn't go inside a little bit. So he's just protecting the inside of the court a bit. And actually, this is where now, as the ball game starts to move, negative pass starts to go and get that pressure a bit more aggressively on. And then again, you see the middle player here taking his frame of reference again as the triangle on the ball, but not dropping so deep because the pressure's good.
And it all links to what Parksy said before around marking is linked with pressing and intercepting, really. And one of the key things around marking is how tightly do you mark? So when you talk about the triangle there, Scoops, to give you the chance to arrive as the ball arrives or to provide more cover, and those decisions might affect the distance between your direct opponent.
Yeah.
So all those little mini decisions as well around what is the right distance to mark from.
Yeah.
If you like, will depend on the context, but just understanding what you're trying to do in the trade-offs with marking.
And I think this is where 2v2 directional practices are really important for young kids, because they can really start to read pressure on the ball with their opposite player, protecting a goal, or even 3v3 with a keeper, because they're starting to learn that in lots and lots of ways, with lots and lots of feedbacks, lots of ways of getting that wrong. So, we can't underestimate the power of really small practices out of possession as well as in possession. And again, we always talk about the in possession in small practices, but the stuff they're learning and the perceptual skills are absolutely fundamental to whatever bigger game you go and play.
But again, even on the mark and things like your footwork can be really important again to the pictures that you see and the information you can take in, and your body shape and all these things all come together again.
It's anticipation of the ball speed as well, how you start to learn to read that. Body shapes of your teammate. So what's your teammate doing for you? So here he's starting to be aggressive, so people can start to get tighter. And then we start to push them back. So it's defensive control again, isn't it?
Yeah. And there's another aspect around, depending on your direct opponent, might dictate as well how closely you need to mark. So if it is their best player, you might need to mark them more closely, because if you give them half a second more time when the ball arrives, and sometimes it might almost feel like it's going against the general defensive principles, but you need to do that to get that extra pressure on the ball.
Yeah.
So again, they're the sort of game craft type decisions that you make within the game often around.
We talk about game orientation.
Yeah.
So which way the game's orientating, you can actually make these decisions off probably easier. So one of the triggers is game orientation, when the marker can get out tighter.
Brilliant. I think the other thing in futsal, Scoobs, around marking is that you have to mark players in lots of different ways. So sometimes you're marking behind, like a traditional centre back against the centre forward. Sometimes you mark in front. I think we might have a clip here to look at about how that happens sometimes.
Yeah, so we like to be in front a lot, so we like to screen the pass and get in front as much as we can, and the player behind. So is this a clip? Yeah, so here the keeper is the job behind. So we really want to threaten the passing lines as much as possible. So if one thing you can think about, we talk about marking the player, but we also talk about marking or pressing passing lines. And actually you can make it just as hard for players on the ball if they haven't got a pass on. So if this player hasn't got a pass on, where does he go? He forces a pass forward, and actually that's an easy pickup or an easy interception. So marking in front is really, really key at certain aspects.
I think the key as well is the space involved. So you can do it when there's not much space behind. Am I right in saying? If that's further up the court, then you don't want to necessarily leave the space behind. But here you can.
Yeah, that's where the strategy of the coach comes in, because there'll be, I like players to mark in front in deep areas, give the keeper that second player to smother. But then, after 12, 14 meters, probably prefer the player to be in behind. But again, it depends, because if your team's pressing high press 2-on-1, you might actually want to be really aggressive. And the modern game's getting to the keeper, sweeper, keeper, where they're actually being that sort of covering player quite high. So, don't forget, in the game, that your keeper is really fundamental to how you want to press. And, if you're in a 2 or 3 collectively as well.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, just wanted to make that clear. That sometimes
football,
in different ways.
I think in football it happens more than people might think in terms of marking in front. If we think of it from as Scoobs was saying around blocking or marking passing lines, really, there's often if there's opponents behind the lines, if you're say midfield and they've got number 10 behind the lines, if you like that, or often wingers or fullbacks as they get higher, you've got 2 choices really: either go with them goal side, or you stay in players only and you stay in your unit and block the passing lines. So it's a vital skill, and again, before, during, after is really important, as is scanning, so you know where the lines are, where the players are, as well as your position, and so all that's vital.
Cool. And then the final one we're going to look at with some futsal clips is intercepting, and we've already talked around how this links, and maybe if you're marking a player and this anticipation, and I know that's probably linked to your perception and your decision, but I think it's really a huge part of intercepting is anticipating whether or not it's the right thing to do and go and win it. Type of interception, maybe off their toes, step in front and win it, or it might be another type, might be if you can't get pressure on the ball and you're maybe screening, what that might look like to try and get them to play forward and then step across and intercept. So just a couple of examples here. One that's stepping in front, and it's difficult to see because it's away from camera because of the television footage. You can't probably see some of maybe the cat and mouse that might have been going on before it, maybe some of the stuff that's gone on previously in the game around whether or not that player thinks he can outwit that player. You know, he might always try and roll a certain way or receive in a certain way that defender's worked out. So that might be part of it.
Yeah, I think what's important is you mentioned anticipation being vital around reading the game before it happens and having some ideas of where the ball might arrive to, but being actually physically prepared in balance. Are you ready? Which again sounds really simple, but having that readiness, especially if you are going to try and deceive, and you need to deceive your opponent.
Yeah, is
vital.
Yeah, to help sort of these cues of I think it's number 7, Robbie here, has been really cute. So if you were to if I was to pause it before the ball gets to this player, now this is what I call our opening out on the back foot. So his hips at the moment are really close to the game. So as the pressure comes, and he opens out on the back foot here, this takes a bit of time. Did you see that? So he's really opened his hips forward to play forward. So the back defender here can see the game quite a lot. It's also it's a vertical flat pass, so it's not on an angle. So that pass is actually quite straight, which allows the interception to come. So the guy's actually Robbie, the 7, is actually marking behind, but it's anticipating from when the ball comes how he's slowly opened his hips up. So he's not used what I'd call oriented control here to try and keep the ball moving. The ball's moved across his body. So the action here is actually quite slow, which allows the sort of anticipation to go on. And then ultimately, like the number 9, if you like, waiting. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and he might be aware that he's got that cover behind him as well. That you'd like to think he might have checked to see that if he does go in and not win it, he's got a mate. He's also close to the line, isn't he? Which is
That's the other thing.
Safer.
Yeah.
Safer when you're close to the line.
Also, just again, quite simply, of how tightly he's marking his opponent will determine how easy you'll then be able to step in front when the time is right. So timing's vital in all of this, as we always talk about, as is deception. But obviously, how you mark then will have implications on what can come next. But that is the context, position on the pitch, reading the triggers and cues, all the things.
He wouldn't be overly tight there because he wouldn't want to be, he's got to mark behind but not want to be rolled. But as the slowness of the action comes, he's then speeding up and accelerating into this sort of tackle. And he would be anticipating that there's a cover, or even the keeper, if he spins out, would cover. So it's a great little interception, I think that is.
One thing I'd say about young players and interceptions is there's a good chance young players will get it wrong a lot. Almost have to get it wrong to find boundaries. Or if they don't get a feel for the boundaries, they'll just stay behind and mark from behind all the time.
Yeah.
That might seem safer at this moment in time, but they never develop the skills of stepping in front. It will take them getting it wrong a lot to figure out when's it right, when's it not right.
Yeah, and why to do it. You know, and the triggers will give you the why. So, you've got to get it wrong and you've got to explain to them why it's a good time. Why was that a good time to do it? Those types of things.
And I guess the last thing I was just going to mention before we see the next one is we talked about the before, during and after. We saw a clip earlier, marking in front, intercepting and it going out. Actually, the after of this, getting in a pass and then making a forward run to be a supporting option. I think that's worth mentioning.
Yeah,
we can see the next clip, which is a slightly different example of intercepting. Maybe where you can't get so much pressure on the ball. This happens a bit in futsal as well. Being aware of what's around you to just intercept a forward pass.
I think this is really clever defending. Wallace is a great player, technically good decision maker. But if you notice here, he's really cute with what he does. Did you see what he did there? If you notice straight away what he did, he checked his shoulder to see where the forward pass is on. And then he's seen somebody move, and then he's basically like a bit of a cat and mouse. He's offered up the line to say it. So there's a little check here, then he's off the line, knowing he can't get really good pressure on. So I think sometimes when we talk about individual pressure and intercepting, it's about the player on the ball being under pressure as much as being close. Sometimes we think good pressure is being close to a player. It might not be the case.
I think just one thing on this Poxy as well around these types of interceptions where it's over maybe a little bit of a bigger distance, or it's more intercepting a pass, if you like, is around the top players leaving passing lines open. It's part of the deception so that they can intercept. And just leaving enough that the player on the ball will think, yeah, the pass is on, but actually it's a trap. You're setting like an almost like intercepting trap.
Yeah.
But again, you need to know the fundamentals of your job and their job before you can start setting those traps. But you can do that as an individual. Obviously, you can do stuff as a team, but the best players will be doing that. Best defenders and in football, best midfielders do that a lot.
And you might set the trap higher up the court because if it goes wrong, it's not going to be a goal. So where you do it as well at the top level is really important to set the traps. It's a little bit like tennis, isn't it? Like if you play tennis, you leave the line open, hoping that you can get a volley or put them into that area. So it reminds me a little bit of tennis in that sense.
Bit of doubles.
Yeah.
Good stuff. So we're now going to look at a couple of football clips and look at where that content might be relevant. Still very much looking at individual actions rather than team or pairs or threes, very much individual actions.
I would just encourage people viewing just to pay real close attention to the individual player closest to the ball as the ball moves, and just see how physically what they do, how they move the head, what they're looking for, as well as obviously the perception and the timing.
One thing as well I don't think we mentioned, I might have missed it, is the moving as the ball travels. So in terms of when you go to put pressure on, not going too early to leave the gap behind. But a lot of these players moving, waiting, and as the ball goes, they're going, so they're arriving as the ball gets there if you can. Yeah,
this is game orientation for me. So once you know which side the game goes, you see like a swarm of players checking their shoulder before or as they go. But the game orientation has been dictated.
And deceleration is as important as acceleration, and as you get into the ball, being able to slow down and be in balance and all the things we've already spoken about.
Yeah. If you look here, Josh saying, looking here, players check the shoulder, put pressure on. I think Henderson comes in here and he's checking as he goes, has a quick look. What am I cutting off? Sees the forward one trying to cut that off. Probably more pressure needed here if you would say anything, because it's a straight pass. Good.
But again, as there's a backwards pass, the next one for me, I think he's able to get better pressure on the next one.
And some examples of some not so good pressure within it, if being really sort of picky as well,
Yeah, definitely.
Good stuff. If we see the next one, I know we've got a few, so. Same again, it's Reading we're looking at here, blue and white. Individual actions. Trying to force play one way with their body position.
Yeah, I think it was Farrell Williams there, really exaggerated with a body position where she's trying to make the play go. Number 4. She's playing as number 10, I think, in the end, but she went number 4. But as you said, sometimes you don't actually get that close to the ball. I think it's as the ball comes across here, I think she points to her mate. She's had a check. She's scanned. She knows where she is, really. She's leaving the passing line open deliberately, ready for the next players to be able to press.
Intercept, not too dissimilar to the one we saw earlier, although it wasn't clean. And then tracking runners here, the player down the bottom having to track their runner as they run off the shoulder. I think when we watch the next one, there might be another example of tracking a runner there. I think the thing for me showing this one is that I mentioned at the start about pressing not being always a high press. It's an individual action. Here we're just looking at players pressing the ball as an individual, but in a deeper area of the pitch. So it is that individual action rather than the team.
I think one of the interesting things is watching players after they go out of the ball, what they do after to get back in position.
Yeah. I think this is what, and also links back to your screening and blocking in midfield. I think, as this Wolves, I think they were, renowned for being a low block and screening, but really understanding what they're doing collectively as well as individually. But I think what's really key is strategy-wise, and this is, another level, when to abort pressure is just as important as what pressure you put on. And that's what I think you're talking about there, when to decide not to carry on pressing because the triggers aren't there to do it. And the team might have changed orientation or bounced out of it. And that's part of being a good presser, is actually knowing when to abort as well.
Yeah. Or even Moutinho, I think, is at the ball now. So he's been, as you say, he's been at the ball. Now he detaches from his opponent back into his shape on the sort of left of the midfield three. So yeah, that thing of what happens afterwards is vital.
Yeah, and they've pretty much abort the pressure here because they want them to draw them on again, and then they start to try and build. We talk about building pressure. So we talk about what phases do you go in as an individual, how we can start to build pressure. So the first one out might get okay pressure on directional, orientate the game, orientate the positional attack. The next one out might be more aggressive. And then the next one out, might be the one that steals, if you like. So we actually talk about second pass pressure and things like that. So actually, as a team, we have an individual responsibility within the building of the pressure. But at that point, the team that's carrying the ball or has the ball might actually get out of it. So you have to go back to square one around building again. And these are the sort of strategy things that you need to add on later once you have good individual, good pair, technique and tactics around what you're trying to achieve as an individual first, if you like.
Yeah, and I keep talking about tracking. I think it's worth looking here, that player, the left-sided player that's tracking his runner. Carrie, you've talked to watch individuals and the biomechanics, the fact that he's turning away from the ball to be able to run forwards. Some people will agree with that, others won't, but just encouraging coaches to look at that. And I think we've seen some examples where in a lot of them, and in futsal too, players turning away from the ball to track a runner, and whether that's something you'd want players to do or not is worth considering. Also,
ideally, from a personal point of view on that, I personally wouldn't. You want in that situation, you ideally want to still see the ball. However, the one thing with all of this is in the heat of battle, if you like, when you might get caught or you misread a situation, you get caught in your danger of being played round or a 1-2 against you. Sometimes that is in that moment the best, because of where you found yourself in the during bit of when you've had pressure on the ball. The way your balance is, it's actually quicker. It's actually better to turn your back. So it's not in the textbook and it's not in the manual, but in the moment when he's done us here, because you're playing against top players who are trying to set traps for you and you're setting traps for them. And sometimes you have to just respond in the best way. And if you're slightly off balance, it might be I need to turn, because if I try and go the other way, by the time I do that, it's too late. So sometimes I think for players of all levels, we do have like models of this is how you should defend, this is what you should do with your footwork, but sometimes you just need to adapt and adjust in the moment to what it throws up.
I do think the thing I like about it though is at least they're running forwards, so we're not trying to track runners running backwards. So I think that's something that's key. I
think you're right, Carol. I think ultimately is not being done in behind. We have a term we say in the final third, save your backside, basically, because you as an individual in that 1v1 duel can't be beat in behind. And we have different ways, but even at the top level, like you say, you'd prefer them to be facing the game, facing the ball, but ultimately the tangles they get in and the priority is not being done in behind in that situation on a low block. But, we talk about things like, and I think you alluded to it before, Parksy, like one option here would be to go into the body and kill the acceleration of the opposite player. So a tactic to not be done in behind could actually be into the body in a wide area, not giving a foul, but it's a contact thing that kills the acceleration. So then you can both run together. So you could actually move forward into body to both run together.
Yeah, it's
things that help.
It's not athletics. You don't need to stay in your track, do you? So it'd be like Usain Bolt. The first thing you do would step across his lane, wouldn't you? You might have a chance then.
You would. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So You know, there's little things that go on in a game, the craft of the game that stop those things happening. Yeah, and in futsal we always use those little things all the time to gain an advantage. You know, could he get a cross in there? That's it. You know, so actually a good defender might actually just get across, hit the body, so they have to check out.
Yeah. And then the last thing, you talked about marking in front. This play here at the right of the midfield three, almost marking in front of is it 6 Pogba? Just checking his shoulder to see where Pogba is and trying to get across him. Maybe for another time to go and have a watch of that. Where are we for slides? So just to summarise, really, thanks ever so much, you two, again, as always, talking through. We've tried to look at pressing, marking and intercepting. Hopefully it's given people something to think about. And until next time, we'll see you soon.